You wake up and your body is wrong. Your throat burns. Your joints ache with a weight that makes rolling over feel impossible. The fever came in the night, slow, and then all at once. And by the time the sun filtered through the entrance of the rock shelter, where your group sleeps, you already knew today would not be a hunting day, not a foraging day, not any kind of productive day at all. No pharmacy, no prescription, no number you can call. For roughly 99% of human history, this was simply what getting sick meant. And yet here you are, alive, watching this. Because for hundreds of thousands of years, your ancestors got sick, and somehow they survived. Not all of them, but enough of them. The question is, what exactly did they do? The answer is older, stranger, and more sophisticated than most people expect. Let's start with the bones. In 1957, an American archaeologist named Ralph Selecki began excavating a cave in the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq. The site was called Shanidar Cave, and what he uncovered there permanently changed the way researchers understood early human life. Buried inside were the skeletal remains of at least 10 Neanderthals, our closest evolutionary relatives, who lived between 65,000 and 35,000 years ago. One of those individuals, catalogued as Shanidar 1 and nicknamed Nandi by the excavation team, should not have survived. His right arm was either amputated or had atrophied to near uselessness from the elbow down. One eye socket showed evidence of a significant injury that likely caused partial or total blindness on that side. His foot and leg displayed signs of severe arthritis. He could not hunt. He could not carry. He could not defend himself or outrun anything. And yet the bones tell a different story. They tell a story of someone who lived for years, possibly decades, with these conditions. Bones don't lie about this. A healed fracture requires immobility and time. A limb that wastes from disuse takes months to reach the stage his arm had reached. Someone fed him, protected him, kept him close to warmth. Shanidar 1 did not survive by himself. Paleoanthropologist Eric Trinkus, who has spent decades studying Neanderthal anatomy, found that healed traumatic injuries appear throughout the Neanderthal fossil record with striking regularity. Healed skull fractures, healed broken ribs, injuries that required months of recovery, during which the individual would have been entirely dependent on others for food and safety. These patterns don't emerge from populations that abandon their sick. They emerge from populations that care for them. The ancient medical system wasn't a system. It was a relationship. So let's reconstruct what actually happened when someone in your band fell ill. Your group was small, somewhere between 15 and 30 individuals, a size that appears again and again in the anthropological record across cultures and continents as the baseline social unit of mobile foragers. Researcher Robin Dunbar has argued that this number isn't accidental. It represents roughly the maximum number of individuals a human can maintain close, trusting relationships with under the cognitive demands of a foraging lifestyle. You knew every person in your group. You had known them your whole life. When you got sick, everyone knew within hours. The immediate response was practical. You were moved closer to the fire. This was not symbolic. Heat was one of the oldest therapeutic tools available, not because your ancestors understood fever pathology, but because they had watched, across generations, that sick people who stayed warm were more likely to survive than sick people who didn't. This was ancient empiricism. Observe, record in memory. Repeat what works. Water was brought to you. Food was prepared in softer forms, chewed, mashed, made easier to swallow for a body that couldn't eat properly. Someone stayed close. Sleep was encouraged and protected. The group's pace adjusted, at least for a day or two, to accommodate the ill. And then came the plants. In 2012, researcher Karen Hardy led a team that examined fossilized dental plaque, called dental calculus, recovered from Neanderthal teeth at the site of Ötzi Cave in northern Spain. Dental calculus is remarkable because it traps microscopic evidence of everything that entered the mouth. Foods, plant fibers, chemicals. What Hardy's team found inside that calculus was not what they expected. There were chemical signatures from plants with no nutritional value, plants that are intensely bitter, plants that no hungry person would eat for sustenance. Among them were yarrow, which has documented antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties, and groundsel, and most strikingly, a member of the poplar family containing salicin, the naturally occurring compound from which aspirin is directly derived. Think about that for a moment. The Neanderthals of Ötzi were using a natural precursor to aspirin, not because they had a label on a bottle, because they had learned, through observation and survival across generations, that certain plants reduced pain and fever in ways that nothing else did. This was not a lucky guess. By the time anatomically modern humans were moving across the globe, a pharmacopoeia, a working catalog of medicinal plants and their effects, had been accumulating for tens of thousands of years. Your ancestors knew which plants reduced fever and which ones stopped bleeding. They knew which roots numbed pain and which barks cleaned wounds. They knew because their grandmothers told them, and their grandmothers' grandmothers before them, in a chain of transmitted knowledge that stretched back further than writing, further than agriculture, further than anything we typically call civilization. Oral tradition was the original medical textbook. We have direct physical confirmation of this. Ötzi the Iceman, a man who died in the Alps around 3300 BCE and was preserved in glacial ice until hikers discovered him in 1991, was found carrying 2 species of fungi attached to strips of leather looped around his equipment. One of them was birch polypore fungus. Research by botanist Klaus Oegel and his colleagues established that Ötzi was suffering from a parasitic intestinal infection at the time of his death, and birch polypore contains compounds now known to be effective against precisely that kind of infection. He wasn't carrying the fungus for decoration. He was carrying it because he was sick, and he knew it might help. Ötzi also had markings tattooed over his joints and the long lines of his body, corresponding to areas where bone analysis showed arthritis and chronic pain. Researchers have noted that many of these marks align closely with pressure points used in acupuncture-style treatments. Not random, not ornamental, placed where he hurt. He was a man in chronic pain who carried a medicinal toolkit and marked his own body with a treatment map. Your ancestors were not stumbling through illness hoping for the best. They were practicing medicine. Imperfect medicine, without germ theory, without sterile technique, without any of the conceptual frameworks that make modern medicine possible. But medicine, nonetheless, built on accumulated observation and passed carefully from one generation to the next. Now here is the part that changes how you see it. Modern medicine is incomparably more powerful. No rational person would choose a poultice of yarrow over antibiotics for a bacterial infection. The gains in human life expectancy since the development of germ theory, vaccination, and surgery are extraordinary. That is not in question. But there is something the ancient model of illness carried that the modern model has partially lost. Not a technique, a structure. When someone in a band of 30 got sick, they were not alone with it. They were surrounded. The sick person was tended to directly, physically, by people who would be genuinely devastated if that person died. The care was not delegated. It was not managed through a screen or handled by a stranger. It was immediate, embodied, and embedded in a web of relationships the sick person had spent their entire life building. Researcher James Pennebaker, whose work on social connection and health spans several decades, has documented that social isolation measurably worsens recovery from illness. It weakens immune response. It slows healing. The people around you are not just emotionally comforting. They are physiologically relevant to your survival. What your ancestors built through necessity was, incidentally, a healing environment. The person in the group with the deepest medical knowledge was not a credentialed professional. It was typically an elder, usually a woman, who had outlived enough illness to know what worked. In anthropologist Polly Wiesner's long-term fieldwork with the Jinwansi people of the Kalahari, begun in the 1970s and continuing for decades, she documented how older women held specialized botanical knowledge that was sought out deliberately in times of illness and treated as genuine expertise, not superstition, knowledge. The kind that comes from watching people get sick and watching what helped them recover. Not everyone made it. That has to be said plainly. Infections that are now trivial took lives. Injuries that now require an hour of surgery ended people in days. Infant mortality was high enough that losing a child was not unusual grief, but ordinary grief. Your ancestors understood death as something that could arrive at any time, and they built their lives around that reality in ways that are difficult to fully comprehend from inside the safety of the modern world. But the ones who were cared for survived at rates that should give you pause. Shanidar I, a man with one functional arm, likely impaired vision, and debilitating arthritis, lived into his late 40s by most estimates. In a world without medicine, as we define it, he was not left behind. He was carried, fed, sheltered, kept alive by people who chose, again and again, to spend their limited resources on someone who could no longer contribute at full capacity. That choice, to sustain the sick, the injured, the vulnerable, was not just compassion. It was also what allowed accumulated knowledge to persist. Every elder who survived past their productive years carried decades of medical observation in their memory. Every grandmother who knew which bark reduced a fever was a living library. Keeping them alive was how the knowledge stayed alive. You exist because your ancestors made that choice tens of thousands of times. You wake up and your body is wrong. You reach for a pill that took millennia to develop, built from a compound your ancestors first pressed against a fever in the form of a bitter plant growing at the edge of a river. You send a message. Someone comes. You are not alone in this. For 300,000 years, that was always the medicine that mattered most.